since at least, say, mid-January, I've been playing around with this idea in my head, an idea inspired by the realization that we apparently now live in a post-truth world of fake news and alternative facts. So this idea would be to deliver an entire sermon in which every single statement I made was a complete lie. Now, my biggest fear is that I wouldn't be able to sustain that level of lying for 20 full minutes, so this morning seemed like a pretty good opportunity to dip my toe in the water. So for the next minute or so, everything I say is going to be a complete lie. Everyone understand? All right. There is nothing easier for a minister than preaching about racism to a room full of predominantly white folks. Every time I have addressed this issue from this pulpit, my message has been universally received with unabashed, enthusiastic approval. Therefore, I am fully confident that today's sermon will cause no pain, no anxiety, no controversy, which is good, because church is a place where we should strive to avoid controversy and discomfort at all costs. Church is where we go to simply reinforce our existing preconceptions about the world and ourselves, rather than seeking to challenge those notions and stretch ourselves to new truths. As we all know, the role of the church is to afflict the afflicted and comfort the comfortable. And today, I guarantee, y'all are going to love everything I say, especially the white folks in here. I am fully confident that following this sermon, I will receive no letters, no emails, no phone calls expressing any kind of disapproval. There is absolutely no chance that someone might get up and walk out in the middle of the sermon, because everything that I'm about to say is going to instinctively and immediately be understood and accepted. This is going to be easy for all of us. And I will definitely be getting y'all out of here on time this morning. Thank you. This spring, we have learned some distasteful truths about our Unitarian Universalist Association. The UUA has nearly 50 paid staff on its congregational life team. Prior to 2011, they were all white. Presently, as I speak to you right now, all 5 lead executives overseeing all 5 regions of our association are all white. For a faith tradition that claims so vociferously and desperately to believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, that claims to be so progressive in its values, that claims to promote diversity and inclusivity, well, we clearly have a lot of work to do. And maybe until that work gets done, maybe we shouldn't be so quick to toot our own horn about how accepting we really are. In looking at the racial breakdown of our association's leadership and paid staff, there is clear evidence of likely unintentional, but definitely systemic racism at work. Now, is it fair to call this kind of racism white supremacy? That is the question that is being asked these days across the UUA and here within our own congregation. The concern is that this term, white supremacy, has a specific narrow definition that historically has been applied only to the very worst, only the most violent and most vile expressions of racism. The KKK, Nazis, neo-Nazis, you get the idea. The concern is that it seems somewhat unfair to apply such a powerfully loathsome term so broadly that it captures expressions of unintentional racism such as might be found in our UUA, perhaps even in our own congregation. To address that question about this more broad application of the term white supremacy, I'd like to make 3 points this morning. First, I think it behooves us to look at exactly who is choosing to use this term in this context, and then to a lesser extent, who is off-put by the term. Now, in this case, within our faith, those suggesting that our practices and culture are steeped in white supremacy are, in fact, people of color. And many, not all, but many, of those who have bristled at the use of that term are themselves white. Now, generally speaking, I don't think that any one individual or group should have the sole discretion to absolutely define certain terms and concepts. However, when it comes to discussing the suffering of any kind of harm, I do think that a certain deference must be given to the victim rather than the perpetrator to describe and define the nature and the extent of that harm. In other words, the oppressed, by virtue of their lived experience, are in a better position to explain and define their oppression than the oppressors, or even those who continue to benefit from the privileges of oppression. So I guess what I'm saying is, in a situation like this, the voices of people of color ought to be centered, not the voices of white folks. And deference ought to be paid to the oppressed. That is, the benefit of the doubt goes to the harmed. Now, that doesn't mean that there is no room for dialogue, but the problem is that often so-called dialogue in these situations devolves into reactivity and defensiveness from white folks. And there is a reason for that. In a 2011 article in the International Journal of Critical Pedagogy, scholar Robin DiAngelo identified a psychological dynamic, a unique defensiveness that is immediately triggered within some white individuals when they are faced with any kind of racial stress that might suggest they harbor or benefit from any kind of intentional or unintentional racism, either on a personal or an institutional level. DiAngelo called this dynamic white fragility. She noted that many white Americans, even the so-called good white liberals, tend to live in an insulated bubble in which they rarely ever have to experience such racial stress. And for this reason, many white Americans have simply never developed the psychological resilience and emotional stamina necessary to be able to have substantive conversations about racism. In other words, many white Americans have essentially been enculturated and socialized to have particularly thin skin when talking about the existence and the nature of racism. So, if there are any white folks in the sanctuary right now who are feeling a little anxious about this topic, the good news is you're probably not alone. More importantly, knowing that this phenomenon of white fragility exists, those of us who experience it can be more intentional and proactive to check that defensiveness when it rears its head in conversations about racism. So as it relates to the question of white supremacy, let us note that the defensiveness some of us feel about a broader application of that term may be an example of white fragility at work. Point number 2. If you strip down the term white supremacy to its bones and you divorce it from the narrow definition that has accrued historically, the literal concept behind the words is, in fact, rather broad. Think of it this way. If an alien from outer space landed on Earth today and had no knowledge of our history or our culture, and that alien then heard the term white supremacy, how might she naturally understand it? Now, there would certainly be some confusion about what the word white means in this context, and that actually is a topic, whiteness as a social construct, that we cannot possibly get into right now. But the word supremacy shouldn't be too problematic for our hypothetical alien. Dictionaries define it in the fairly obvious way: highest in rank, power, or authority; highest in degree or quality; chief; top; first; prime. So our alien friend, hearing the term white supremacy for the very first time, would not necessarily assume that the term would be applied exclusively to the KKK or to Nazis. Rather, if she were looking at it literally, which parenthetically, all good science fiction has taught me all aliens and robots do, if she looked at the term literally, she would likely understand white supremacy far more broadly. maybe as an ideology of operationalized racism that both consciously and subconsciously, both intentionally and unintentionally, both individually and systematically, places the white race and the culture of whiteness hierarchically above other races, above non-white cultures. Now, our American history and culture is replete with examples of our preference for whiteness, examples both tragically horrific and horrifically banal. Native American genocide, black slavery, the forced relocation of Japanese Americans in World War II, anti-miscegenation laws that sought to prevent racial amalgamations that would dilute white bloodlines, Jim Crow laws, unfair labor and immigration policies that afflict Latin Americans, unrelenting media portrayals of people of Middle Eastern descent as terrorists. Other expressions of our near ubiquitous cultural preference for whiteness includes the pressure felt by members of non-white cultures within America to assimilate to white norms in order to gain greater acceptance and improve their chances of succeeding in whatever odd and racist way that particular word might be defined. Dress, language, religion, names, posture. The primacy of whiteness is exhibited in the anxiety felt by white folks when seeing a black teenager in a hoodie, or seeing any large black man, even if his hands are up. Perhaps the greatest, most horrific achievement of this more broadly defined white supremacy, its crown jewel, is the planting of internalized racism within the hearts and minds of people of color themselves. Like when, even today, a black girl who is given the choice between two dolls, identical except for skin tone, sometimes chooses the white doll because it is prettier. Replications of the infamous doll test from the 1940s still sometimes return these results. When in this country, little black boys and girls, little brown boys and girls, little yellow boys and girls grow up feeling inherently less than little white boys and girls, then something is terribly, horribly, god-awfully wrong. And it doesn't require a conspiracy of intentionally racist toy manufacturers to suggest that these feelings of internalized inadequacy are the fruit of an entire culture and system of living that places whiteness at the top of the pyramid. Literally speaking, this is white supremacy. On the other hand, the idea that the term white supremacy should apply only to folks like the KKK is of course understandable because primarily that's how it's been used for decades. So why change now? I'd like to suggest the possibility, perhaps, that way back in the past, when the term white supremacy was first originally used to describe the actions of the Klan and the Nazis, that the original usage of that term was itself an example of racism and white fragility, in that it represented an intentionally euphemistic way to describe detestable acts of hatred and bigotry, thus minimizing the true and full extent of their horridness. In other words, applying a very broad descriptor like white supremacy to white people who lynched black people or incinerated Jews might actually represent an act of intentional understatement coming from sympathetic and therefore complicit white folks who refused to apply a more realistically descriptive and damning label. And perhaps then, unconsciously, all of us perpetuate that understatement and minimization by so narrowly applying that term today. Last week, a group of white nationalists in Charlottesville, Virginia, led by Richard Spencer, protested the removal of a Confederate statue by gathering together at night and chanting "All White Lives Matter" while holding up torches. Richard Spencer is the so-called alt-right leader who, immediately following Donald Trump's election victory in November, led a group of white nationalists in repeatedly offering the Nazi salute while shouting, "Hail Trump." At one time, he also employed a writer who published an article that gave consideration to the rationale of black genocide. Is Richard Spencer a white supremacist? Of course he is. But he is also far more than just that, and perhaps failing to more precisely and explicitly define him serves to perpetuate his vile doctrines and values. White supremacists like Richard Spencer are domestic right-wing white terrorists. What those people did in Charlottesville last week, bearing torches at night around a Confederate statue, was not a benign act of free speech. It was an act of terrorism. Now, it may not meet the legal definition of terrorism, but it was nevertheless an act designed to place fear and terror in the hearts of black Americans. It was an act of violence. Now, it may not have been an act of physical violence, but it was nevertheless an act of emotional, spiritual, and psychological violence. Make no mistake, it was a targeted attack against black Americans, and it did harm. Imagine, if possible, what it must be like to be a black resident of Charlottesville right now. Imagine being the parent of a black child in Charlottesville right now. One thing Charlottesville taught us last week is that people like Richard Spencer have become so emboldened in today's social and political climate that they don't even feel the need to wear masks and hoods anymore. White Americans have a responsibility to unequivocally denounce these kinds of racist acts whenever they happen. Because as Matthew Leckie observed, quote, "Overtly racist white people are the sword of white supremacy. Silent white people are its shield." Now, of course, it's relatively easy to attack the explicit, virulent racism of Richard Spencer. It's far more difficult to attack the less explicit, less virulent racism perhaps buried deep within ourselves and within our beloved institutions. Which leads me to my third point about the use of the term white supremacy. Anti-racism work is a field of scholarly study. It is a point of intersection which includes such academic subjects as history, anthropology, sociology, psychology, linguistics, and economics, etc. And as with any scholarly or academic field, it evolves over time. Innovations occur, new models and theories and practices displace old ones, bringing with them new language. We are so willing to accept new innovations in technology and other fields, yet as a nation, we seem hesitant to do the same when it comes to the field of anti-racism work. Many white folks today cling to obsolete models, obsolete ideas, and obsolete practices when it comes to understanding how to exist multiculturally. It's like using Windows 95 as your operating system in 2017. These models, ideas, and practices are no longer accepted as best practices. And in some ways, adherence to those old ways actually works against the advancement of racial justice. The broadening of the definition of white supremacy is perhaps but one example of this. Another quick example I can offer you in very, very broad strokes with the limited time I have this morning is the general idea of colorblindness. White people love to claim to be colorblind. And that is understandable because for decades we were all taught that not seeing color was the answer to racism. Now, in fairness, for a time, a limited form of colorblindness was a useful answer. in the sense that it was a useful evolutionary step in the right direction. Remember that decades ago in America, the explicit norm was for white folks to see nothing but color and treat people of color as second-class citizens and to consider their respective cultures as inferior. So in the mid-20th century, a move toward limited color blindness, a move toward a sense of universalization that encouraged white folks of that era to focus more on the commonalities among the races rather than the differences between them. To, as MLK famously said, judge someone by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin, that was literally a revolutionary idea and absolutely necessary for the advancement of racial justice. But today, colorblindness has become a weapon that perpetuates oppression by freezing the status quo instead of moving us all on a trajectory toward greater justice, liberation, and ultimate equality. It is misapplied notions of universalization and colorblindness that have served as a justification for white people to promote the idea that all lives matter as a defensive reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement. Many white folks suffering from acute white fragility simply don't have the stomach to look at the unique suffering of black people today because it is too painful and guilt-inducing. Hence the desire for a colorblind lens. With a colorblind lens, nobody needs to notice, for example, that in America today, the average median black household is worth around $7,000. The average Latinx household is worth about $8,000, while the average median white household is worth over $111,000. $111,000 versus $7,000, but let's not look at race. Being willfully blind or ignorant to racial differences not only frustrates the advancement of justice, liberation, and equality, it also flattens all of our differences by erasing a person's racial or cultural identity. And that is not celebrating diversity. That is enforcing assimilation. The larger point here is that many white folks today are relatively ignorant about current trends in racial justice theory and practice. But if all of us are to be serious about fighting racism, then we cannot cling to older, simpler, more comfortable models that we are already familiar with. It is going to take a lot of self-examination, a lot of self-education, and a lot of hard work. In other words, one sermon is not going to do it. So this is my incredibly broad call to action for all of us this morning. Wake up, get educated, and then act. Because honestly, trying to act before waking up and educating yourself will lead to a lot of pain, heartache, and confusion, and I'm speaking from personal experience. The responsibility to tear down systemic racism is primarily borne by those of us who benefit the most from the continuation of that system. Nevertheless, the actual work of tearing down systemic racism is borne by all of us, both people of color and white people, but for very different reasons. To paraphrase a recent sentiment by Alicia Garza, a co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, people of color must work to tear down white supremacy in order to save their lives. White people must do so in order to save their souls. Whether we like it or not, we are all in this together, each of us working out our own salvation, for we are, all of us, in a form of bondage. Our respective chains are very, very different, make no mistake. Nevertheless, they are very much interconnected. As we begin to close today, I ask you to consider thoughtfully, meditatively, prayerfully, these excerpted words from the great James Baldwin in a letter to his nephew. There is no reason for you to try to become like white people. and there is no basis whatever for their impertinent assumption that they must accept you. The really terrible thing, old buddy, is that you must accept them. And I mean that very seriously. You must accept them and accept them with love. For these innocent people have no other hope. They are, in effect, still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. They have had to believe for many years and for innumerable reasons that black men are inferior to white men. The danger in the minds of most white Americans is the loss of their identity. By a terrible law, a terrible paradox, those innocents who believe that your imprisonment made them safe, they are losing their grasp of reality. But these men are your brothers, your lost younger brothers. And we, with love, shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it. We cannot be free until they are free. If Baldwin's words and his pity for the plight of white people is a little too difficult to accept this morning, then consider these more familiar words from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We must all learn to live together as brothers, or we will all perish together as fools. We are tied together in the single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. The work of combating racism and white supremacy, however you ultimately choose to define that term, is at its core deeply spiritual work. And if we as a church, as a people of faith, hope to fully embody the ideals of the beloved community, we must be willing to ask the hard questions of ourselves. We must be willing to look deep inside within the dark and shadowy places to uncover our own biases, bigotries, fears, and ignorance, and understand how they have contributed to the perpetuation of racism in our nation, in our greater faith, in our congregation, and in our individual lives. May we each have the courage and fortitude to do this most sacred work. Blessed be.